Hey
Okay,
everyone, it's
great.
Lawrence
I see
Mack
that.
here, real estate broker out of Mississauga and Toronto. And I'm here with Jessie Ma, founder of Castle Law. How are you doing, Jessie?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for
That's
inviting me, Lawrence.
that's awesome. Today we are going to talk about buying and selling property for a non-resident, as there is like a new law coming up January 1st, 2023. And I guess we just have a lot of questions about what it all means and what happens if you are not a resident here. So Jesse, if you could tell us a bit about your firm.
Yep. I'm the founder partner of Castle Law. We're a boutique law firm in North York, and we focus on commercial real estate, residential real estate, commercial transactions such as buying and selling companies, as well as commercial leasing and property development.
Cool. Sounds good. So we're going to leave all the questions till the end, but in the meantime, if you guys want to type in your questions in the chat or type them into the Facebook group or email me, I can bring them up afterwards. So I guess let's just get started. So who's considered a non-resident and how does it affect people as of like today?
Well, for the most part, a non-resident is someone who is obviously, non-Canadian, who is not a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. But for income tax purposes, it's a little bit different. You could be considered a non-resident as well if you don't reside in Canada anymore and have declared yourself as a non-Canadian taxpayer, even though you are a Canadian citizen or a Canadian permanent resident. And to qualify for that, you actually have to pay a departure tax before you leave. So, for example, if you're a Canadian citizen or permanent resident and you're living in, say, Hong Kong for 8 years, but if you continue to pay Canadian income taxes every year, then you're not considered a non-resident. So it
Okay.
is a bit of a process to get yourself structured and leave Canada. But if you continue to pay Canadian income taxes, then you're still considered a resident of Canada for
Okay,
income
so a lot
tax
of it has to
purposes.
do with, I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of this has to do with taxes, right?
Yeah, but what's important to know is that the definition of a non-resident really depends on which statute applies. So if you're talking about the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, that definition is very different from the Income Tax Act. And there are certain tests as well in the Income Tax Act to determine whether you're a non-resident or not. But I won't get into those tests
Okay.
because it's a little complicated.
That's not a problem. So let's start with the basic, I guess, situation. You have somebody who is not a resident, so they're not even a citizen. They maybe live overseas or maybe in the States, and they want to buy a home here. So what are the steps and what happens? Or what are the limitations, I guess?
So if you're a non-resident and not a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, there's quite a few restrictions. There isn't currently like a legal restriction to buy any property in Ontario right now, but there will be a new law that will come into effect January the 1st,
Mhm.
2023. So that's just a month and a bit away, where non-Canadians are prohibited from purchasing residential real estate in Canada for a period of 2 years. That new act is called the Prohibition on the Purchase of Residential Property by Non-Canadians Act. So it's pretty pretty straightforward name. And the residential property there includes basically any sort of family dwelling or house or similar building where there's going to be three or less dwelling units. So far, under the pending act, doesn't look like vacant land that is zoned residential would fall under this realm of the definition of residential property. But under this act, it could change in the future just because it's quite new and it's very short and vague.
Right. So the actual act is kind of vague and just not 100% black and white. So there are, I guess, some
Yeah.
questions about how it all affects everything. So let's assume, I guess, let's take the basic situation. You're living in the States, you're living in Hong Kong, or you're living somewhere, and you want to go buy a place because you want to live in Canada. Right now, you aren't a citizen, you don't really have your permanent residence, but that's like your plan, and you want to buy just a condo or a home. So I guess the first thing right now, as of today, before January 1st, you could buy it like right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can enter into a contract right now. And the prohibition, because it starts January the 1st, 2023, if you've already entered into a contract before that date, then it's excluded from this prohibition.
Mhm.
There's a slight gray area though, which is that if the contract has conditions in it, for example, and those conditions don't get satisfied until after January the 1st, 2023, there's argument that it won't fall, it won't be excluded from this prohibition. So to be on the safe side, I always advise agents and non-resident buyers to make sure that they have a firm deal before January the 1st.
All right.
That way, you know for sure that it will be exempted and
Right.
be
So
a
as long as you
fine.
have a firm deal before January 1st, and let's just say you close like in March or something like that, it should be okay under the act as of today.
Yeah, yeah, correct. As long as you have a binding contract that
Okay.
that
So a
doesn't have any
binding,
conditions for the buyer to sell it to get out of that contract.
right, a binding and firm contract. So as of today, if you were to buy it, what are the taxes involved? So let's just round numbers, say it's like $1 million house that you need to buy. What are the taxes involved for a non-resident to purchase?
So if you are to purchase it today, the taxes involved would be the non-resident speculation tax,
Mhm.
which is 25%.
Right.
And that applies to basically any sort of residential property. Non-designated lands would be things like agricultural land, commercial property, and industrial land. Those are exempt from the non-resident speculation tax.
Mhm.
And any sort of apartment buildings that have more than 6 dwelling units. So if you have a big apartment building with 8 units that you're renting out to other people, that's okay.
Mhm.
That's not a designated land as well. If the non-resident buyer has already entered in a contract before October the 25th of this year, the tax would have been 20%, because they just raised it March 30th, 2022. And then before March 30th, 2022, the tax would have been 15%.
All right.
So
So
some people might
previously,
have bought pre-construction condos, for example, in April 2018. They have to pay 15% on that,
right. So
on the
previously it
purchase
was
price.
15%, and then they raised it to 20%, and then raised it to 25%, and then but then the federal government just said you can't buy it anyway.
Yeah, pretty
So,
much. Yeah, but
okay.
those speculation taxes, they still apply just because many people could have entered into contracts, years beforehand, right?
Right. So in the case where let's just say somebody's just buying $1 million property, and then there's like a 20% tax. When is that paid exactly? Is it just on
That
closing?
is, yeah, it's paid on closing at the same time as when they have to pay for the land transfer tax. So this non-resident speculation tax is in addition to the land transfer tax that all buyers have to pay.
Right.
And it gets paid at the same time on the closing day.
Okay. So the additional taxes right now then someone would have to pay would be the Ontario land transfer tax, the municipal tax if you're in Toronto, and then in
Yeah,
addition, you'd have to pay like 20% the NRST non-resident speculation tax if you needed to. And then
yeah,
there are
correct.
ways of getting that money back. Is that correct?
Yeah, so for the non-resident speculation tax, there's rebates available.
Mhm.
So for example, if you are an international student, you can apply for a rebate if you can show that you've been enrolled in a full-time full-time program, and continuous for at least 2 years from the day that you purchased it. If a foreign national or non-resident is working in Ontario, they'll also qualify as well. And there's also specific timeframes as to how many hours that they've worked, or is going to work in Canada in order to qualify for that rebate. As well, if you are a foreign national who is purchasing a property with a spouse who is, or a common law partner who is a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, then you also qualify for that rebate. And lastly, if you are a foreign national with no ties to Canada right now, but you end up becoming a Canadian citizen or permanent resident within 4 years of the date of purchase, then you also qualify for that rebate. But you have to have lived in the property as your primary residence for the full 4 years.
For the full 4 years. Okay. So you'd have
Yeah, and you
to,
have to still own the property um, when you make that application for the rebate.
okay. So basically somebody like, let's just say they're thinking of immigrating to Canada. They don't really have their paperwork ready, but like the ball's rolling. So they buy a property and then they pay their tax, whether it's like 20% or whatever it is. Then within the next
Mhm.
4 years, they need to become a citizen or get their PR so that after that point, they can apply within the 4 years to get that 20% back. That's correct?
Yeah, yeah, correct.
Okay. And then what are the limitations if like one of like the two spouses is a Canadian citizen, but the other one isn't? Like, does that, for example, both for the prohibition and for the taxes?
So as a spouse, you do like as a spouse, if you're buying property with a spouse and you're both going to be living in there, there's you don't have to pay for the tax, as well as you aren't going to be prohibited from buying the property. But the key thing is that you're going to have to be living there as a primary resident.
Right. Okay. That was the question, if the tax was raised to 25%. And yeah, like depending on when you bought the property, it was like 15%, then 20%, then 25%, then you weren't allowed to buy it. So depending on the time that you're reading this and when the actual firm contract was, it's a different rate. So I'm just using 20% right now, but we can just as round numbers. Okay,
Yeah.
I think that's all the questions I have with the non-resident. So get back. Anything else about that you can think about, just from purchasing point of view as a non-resident?
It's pretty straightforward. Like, I mean, it's probably going to get transitioned out eventually, just depending on how long this ban is going to happen for. But the key thing is really just to know when the contract was entered into in order to determine the amount of tax payable, and then also whether it even falls under designated land or not.
Okay, and then I guess the the purchaser's lawyer can help them with that evaluation about what is legal and what's not. And
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll be asking all the questions as to whether the buyer is a non-resident or not. And if they have to pay for the tax, then we'll obviously make sure that they have the money available. Preparation is key, right? So we don't want them to know about it sort of like a week before closing and then they realize they have to come up with an extra, 20 or 25%. That's a lot.
yeah, for sure. So I mean, I highly recommend, both as realtors for your clients and if you are buying yourself, really engage a professional such as Jessie, because it's your particular situation might be special. Like there's just a lot of little bit of I guess nooks and crannies in the act, and just what it means to be a non-resident, that kind of stuff, that you just want to be careful about which side of the law you're on and how much tax that you actually owe. So that so just to reiterate, because somebody asked that again, yeah, so basically as long as you have a firm offer before January 1st and you're closing after January 1st, it should be okay. And that especially comes up with a lot of pre-con, because they obviously, a lot of people have had a firm contract for their pre-construction condo or house, this year, last year, the year before, kind of stuff, and it's going to close after January 1st. And so maybe that's why they have it there.
Yeah.
Give me a second. There's some other questions. What if the parent is on sponsorship and they buy with their children who is PR and the same rules apply to the spouse? Okay, so Ramit, it sounds like a more complex question for this forum. I think the best way for that question, it's just like a specific family situation where you got different spouses and families and whatever, and different money. Yeah, so that one you should probably talk directly with either Jessie or with the client's lawyer and see what makes sense for that one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. What if a non-resident buys a property, pays the tax, and then becomes a resident a month after the closing? Can you get a refund? If a non-resident buys a property, pays the tax, and becomes a resident. Yeah, so basically, I'll let Jessie answer this, but the question again was, so the non-resident buys a property and then they become a permanent resident like a month afterwards. Can they get a refund?
Yeah, they can get a refund as long as they're living in that property as a primary residence during that time.
Yeah, so they have to live in the property. They probably live in the property when they're applying for it, and it has to be within 4 years, and then they should be able to get the money back. Have they processed any of the refunds so far with any of that, out of curiosity, or have you dealt with that, or is that something that you don't deal with directly?
To be honest, I haven't had any clients that have dealt with it yet, because most of them are actually residents or permanent residents of Canada. Or they haven't become one yet. So
right. So I mean, it takes time.
Yeah, there's a huge backlog.
Great. Okay, so I think that's good for the purchasing as a non-resident. So let's talk about selling as a non-resident. So how is that differently than, if I was just to sell my home, I get a bunch of money and for the bank, I buy a home, whatever it is. How is it different with somebody who is a non-resident and they're selling their property?
So as a non-resident, they are required to pay a withholding tax under the Income Tax Act, which is Section 116. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. So they have to pay withholding tax on any sort of taxable Canadian property or Canadian source passive income. So if you're going to sell a property, you have to withhold either 25% or 50%, depending on whether the property is a depreciable property or non-depreciable. So depreciable property is basically like an investment property where you're renting it out to tenants, and that tax would be 50% withholding tax. Otherwise, if it's a non-depreciable property, so if it was used for your own personal use, or it was a recreational property, and you were just going, the non-resident was visiting it every 6 months, that would be a 25% withholding tax.
Okay, so the general idea with withholding tax is that the government wants their tax money. Is that correct?
Yeah, and one of the reasons why the 50% is higher for depreciable property is they just want to make sure that the non-resident has been filing for income taxes on their rental income throughout the years that they have been leasing it out. And that's sort of one way to ensure that it's all been paid for, which is sort of, they'll have to sell it eventually, right? Or pass it on to someone else. So that's one way that the Canadian government gets those non-residents.
Okay, so just to rewind a bit for the people who actually don't know about this, that this general idea is that the government wants their taxes. So if somebody owns a property and they're renting it out and then they eventually sell it, there's a bunch of taxes there and the government wants that money. So if the person isn't living in Canada and they're non-resident, they're like, well, how do we get our tax money? And so the way they get the tax money is through the buyer, which is you, if you are purchasing a property. Is that correct?
Yeah, so basically the seller has to pay it, but if the seller doesn't pay it within a certain time frame, the CRA can actually go after the buyer and and have the buyer pay for that withholding tax. That's why, as a buyer's lawyer, it's important to make sure that we get the right affidavits from the sellers and the seller's lawyer to ensure that the seller is not a non-resident. In the agreement of purchase and sale, though, like under the standard form under Section 17, it does say that if CRA does go after the purchaser for the tax money, the purchaser has obviously a right to claim it back from the seller, and the purchase price should be credited by that amount. But like that, you usually don't really have to deal with that clause unless the lawyers weren't careful, right? and for whatever reason, the purchaser ends up having to pay for that non-residency tax. And there's a lawsuit that happens.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, again, just to reiterate it for the people who don't really understand. So let's just say you're a buyer, you're either a realtor helping someone buying or just someone who's purchasing like a condo for $500,000 or something like that. If the person who's selling you the condo owes taxes, even though you bought the condo, the government's going to make you pay those taxes, or they're going to want that money somehow. Like that's like the main problem. So like if your lawyer isn't really diligent in figuring this out, or you aren't really diligent in figuring this out, then you're going to have to pay these extra taxes. And so that's what Jesse's talking about in terms of the withholding. So what happens is when you know that the person is a non-resident, then you have to withhold, like, let's just say 25%. Like in a separate account before it gets released. Because even though, like just say as a buyer, you pay the money to the seller, and even though the taxes are still owed, I mean, you could sue the seller, but for the same problem that the government can't really get the money from the seller who's like in a different country, it's difficult for you to go sue somebody in a different country for the amount that they owe you. That's roughly what we're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. So you have here so the non-residents as well, like, so they have to basically pay income tax on the property as well as any type of capital gains, if there is any, and also like basically income from the rentals. And so those are all the taxes that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, like there's the income would be 25% of the gross amount received from the rental income. But there's also a new tax now, which is called the underused housing tax, which is sort of got enacted, and it's retroactive as of January the 1st of this year. So what that means is basically if you're a non-resident owner of a residential property, and you're not, living in it or you're not really using it and it's just vacant, there is a tax of 1% on the value of the unused or underused residential property. And that value is determined based on the fair market value, or the price that it sold at if you were going to sell it this year, for example.
Okay. So that's other information that you'll have to know if you're buying a property that's owned by a non-resident. And lastly, if you are buying or selling a property and your client or you yourself are non-resident, so how do you normally do it in terms of the legal logistics? Because in the past we'd have to drive into the office, sign a bunch of papers, show some ID, and then it gets done. But nowadays a lot of things are done digitally and virtually.
Yeah, so I mean, acting for non-resident clients have become a lot easier for us, like after the pandemic, actually, because that's really pushed things forward in the legal industry, allowing us to meet clients by video call and signing documents electronically. Um, it used to be that they have to come and sign with wet signatures, etc. So non-resident clients would either have to sign in front of a notary public in their own country and then send the documents over, or get a power of attorney, and get an attorney to sign on their behalf. So nowadays, the process is more relaxed. So we just meet with them as if they're a normal client, because most of my clients now actually want to meet by video call and sign electronically as well.
For sure.
The only difference is with the ID verification. Sometimes we aren't able to verify it because we're not qualified to verify non-Canadian IDs. So for that part, they'll need to actually go to a notary public in their own country, and get their IDs notarized
Okay.
before we can, continue to sign the closing documents, etc. But if it's a non-resident who lives in Hong Kong but is in fact a Canadian citizen and has Canadian IDs like Canadian passport or Ontario driver's license, then we can verify it online, and usually that's they basically just show their IDs on the video call, so that we can do.
Oh, so that helps a lot. So for
Yeah.
people who don't know, notary public, basically the person that does not live here needs to get a lawyer or somebody to verify they are who they are. That's what she means by notary public. But the process seems easier now that if there's a Canadian ID of some sort that you can identify, such as driver's license or passport, then you can just do it through Zoom. Is that normally what you use?
Yeah, driver's license, passport, SIM card, even a credit card works from an A-lender bank, so like TD, Scotiabank, etc.
Oh, that's good. And then same thing with the signing. I guess you just do digital signing now, or you don't have to be in the office.
Yeah, so I'll pretty much, even with my clients who are local, a lot of them they work and they might have an hour break during a work day, so they prefer to also sign documents electronically as well. So typically we'll send a big closing package, like an e-signature package that they carry on their phone, iPad, or computer. Just basically draw on their signature on the portal. And then we go through the documents through a Zoom or a Teams call, and I would typically just share my screen and go through the documents like that.
Yeah, cool. And what about sending money over to somebody who's overseas? Is that usually a problem? Do you just wire it, or how is that done?
Yeah, so the transfer of funds is pretty much the same as well as for a lot of our local clients, except that we're just transferring funds over to an international bank in some cases if it's a net sale proceeds. The only difference really is that it could take another day or two more. But that's also something to keep in mind for non-resident buyers, is that depending on the bank, sometimes it'll take 1 or 2 business days, but it can take up to a week. So we've had a situation where for some odd reason, the funds coming from Bank of China actually have taken longer than expected. So unfortunately, we might actually have to extend that closing.
Makes sense. And then when you send the funds, I guess it's just going to be in Canadian dollars and then converted however they convert it. Is that normally how it works?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, they'll have to enter in the funds information as it's Canadian dollars.
As Canadian dollars, and then it just gets sent over, and then the bank does a 4x or whatever it is, and then whatever happens.
Yeah.
Okay. I think those are all the questions I have. So I'm going to open up to other people, but before then, is there anything else you like to say about non-residents either purchasing or selling that maybe we didn't cover?
I think we covered like quite a bit, but obviously with a lot of these rules, there's always exemptions and exclusions from what is considered a non-resident or what is considered residential property. So every act is different. What I would suggest is always to just, seek legal advice or seek accounting advice in order to determine whether or not a certain tax is payable, and if it is, how much. The key to acting for a non-resident client is just to make sure that you're prepared, and also that the client is aware of these different taxes that could apply to them. They don't really need to know like exactly like whether it is or not, but that it could be, so that they can go and find the right advice and get the right answers.
That makes sense. Actually, a quick question here. Someone was saying if they were purchasing a property in Quebec as a non-resident, I guess what's different? So what's different?
So I'm an Ontario lawyer, so I
Yeah.
can only talk about Ontario specifically. But the ban and the prohibition against non-Canadians buying property in Canada is a federal law. So it would apply to Quebec as well. Basically, it's any property in Canada that is considered a residential property.
Okay, well, there you go. So after January 1st, then you have 2 years that you can't buy anything. Okay, so if that's the case, I'm going to open up for questions right now. If you guys have any questions, I guess raise your hand or you can just start talking. I'm going to just start scanning all the question and answer. It's difficult for me to read it while talking. Normally it's okay, but a lot of the comments are very long. He's fully understand his lawyer, but it's resolved, but he could back to the buyer's agent to ask the seller to. Okay, so the question here is for the non-resident tax. If you're purchasing, and the seller may or may not be a non-resident, is it good practice for the realtor to just start getting involved to get the information, or typically do the lawyers just like talk with each other and deal with it?
Yeah, so typically the lawyers will always talk to each other just to make sure that the client is either a resident or, a non-resident. But in some cases, it's always helpful to have the agent involved as well. Because sometimes, like at least what I find, like sometimes the client has a better relationship with the agent because they've been, advising them and have been, taking them around or showing them houses for a much longer period. So sometimes clients respond to agents more than they respond to me, or maybe they're just scared to respond to me because they think every single time they talk to me, they're going to get billed.
Yeah.
So it's always helpful to have the agent get involved is what I find. And, I always think of us as a team when we're working with agents and the mortgage broker and our clients. Things always go smoother when we're all working together and we're on the same page.
Okay, so I guess the realtors just go ask or just sort of get a quick heads up to see if there's anything out of the ordinary, and then just let the lawyer know.
Yeah.
Okay, that was in buy property along. No, non-resident buy property along with a resident. So basically, what happens, I guess, again, I mean, it doesn't have to be a spouse, but you're just buying it with your friend. One of them was a resident, one of them is a non-resident. What happens?
So if you're doing that for the ban, the only exemption is if you're buying it with a spouse. If like there's obviously other exemptions as well. So things like if you happen to be a partner in a partnership, or if you happen to be a shareholder in a Canadian company that owns real property. So long as you don't, as a non-resident, you're not owning more than less than 90%, less than 10%, then you would be able to purchase the property as well.
Okay. What about corporations? How does corporations affect into this, both before January 1st and after January 1st? Some clients ask me about that as well.
So that one's a little bit more complicated. They don't really have a clear answer. But generally speaking, at least for non-residency speculation taxes, if a non-resident is a shareholder of a corporation, and they hold less than 10% or 10% or less in the voting shares, then that's okay.
Okay, so, but if they own more percentage, then it's a problem. Or it might be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so if you have a corporation and you want to do it, then you should talk with your lawyer and see what makes sense. So the parent sponsorship and then buy with their children, his PR, same rules apply. Yeah, that's another question just about the parents were buying with the kids and the parents are on sponsorship, but the kid is not. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a little complex like that. But again, if you have that particular question, I think you should talk with the lawyer just to get an idea of the nitty-gritties of that particular situation. I think that is all the questions I have. Does anyone have any other questions? No? Going once? Okay. Well, I think that is all the questions for now. So Jessie, if people have questions and want to get a hold of you, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can send me an email. I can type it in the chat, which is jma@castelaw.ca.
Sure.
I also have a little cheat sheet that I can send to people as well if they send me an email.
Oh, that's good. So if everyone wants to send Jessie an email, she can send you a cheat sheet about non-resident buying and selling. What is the cheat sheet on?
Yeah, it's for non-residents who are either buying or selling, basically acting for non-resident clients.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that would be very helpful for everybody. So if you want that and you can't get a hold of Jessie, I will put the email address everywhere. But if you can't get a hold of her, then just talk with me and I'll just forward it over. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today, Jessie. Really appreciate it. Again, that's
No problem. Thank
Jessie
you for
Ma
having me.
Jessie Ma from Castle Law and Lawrence Mack, real estate broker out of Mississauga and Toronto, and founder of Real Estate Rookies. And that's it. Bye for now.
Bye.